The wedding they never knew about a daughter's journey to freedom and self-worth. My wedding day began as if in a dream, with golden sunlight casting warmth over the venue, my friends buzzing around, and laughter echoing through the air. My fiancé, Lucas, stood waiting for me, a look of joy mixed with pride on his face. And then there was my grandfather, his hand, weathered by time, holding mine tightly as we prepared to walk down the aisle. I could feel his love and pride radiating, his presence was steady and reassuring. A silent promise that I was cherished. The only thing missing? My parents. But their absence was no accident. For as long as I could remember, my parents had always made me feel like a shadow. Someone whose value was always second to my younger brother, Mike. From the moment he was born, my mother especially seemed to pour her entire heart into him. At first, I tried to brush it off as typical sibling favoritism, hoping for moments of mother-daughter bonding that never came. But over the years, as Mike grew up, it became painfully clear that I was a mere afterthought. Everything revolved around him, his activities, his needs, his slightest discomfort. It was as though my existence only served as a counterpoint to highlight his importance. My father, in his own way, tried to be supportive but lacked the strength to challenge my mother's clear bias. He was a gentle man, and although he showed me glimpses of affection, he never stepped up for me in ways that mattered. Instead, it was my grandfather who became my anchor. He lived across the country, and I could only see him on rare occasions. But he always made me feel understood and respected. I clung to our phone calls and visits, a thread of love I held onto amidst a sea of indifference. Growing up, I often hoped my accomplishments would finally earn me the attention I craved. There was the time I made it to the final round of my school's poetry competition, only for my mother to dismiss it because Mike had a soccer game the same day. My excitement melted into quiet disappointment as she rushed out the door, leaving me with a whispered apology and a promise she would celebrate with me later. But later never came. Another time, I received top honors at my school, and while my teachers praised me, I felt a hollow ache because I knew my family wouldn't care. As the years passed, Mike continued to bask in my mother's undivided attention, while I struggled to find my footing. He was spoiled and entitled, quick to throw tantrums when things didn't go his way. My parents indulged him, feeding his self-centered behavior until it became a defining trait. For him, life was a stage, with my parents as his enthusiastic audience. Meanwhile, I became more reserved, pouring myself into my studies and friendships, finding solace in things that didn't require parental approval. Meeting Lucas was like a breath of fresh air. He was kind, attentive, and, for the first time, I felt truly seen. Lucas saw through my walls, my quiet resilience, and he gave me a space where I could simply be myself. Over time, we became each other's best friends, eventually falling in love. He knew about my family dynamics, and it was his unwavering support that gave me the courage to dream beyond the limitations of my upbringing. With him, I envisioned a life where I could feel cherished and valued. When Lucas proposed, it was a simple yet profound moment. We didn't need a grand gesture, it was just the two of us, deciding to build a life together. We began planning our wedding with the vision of a warm, intimate ceremony filled with the people who genuinely cared for us. As we went over the guest list, Lucas gently suggested that I invite my parents, reminding me that sometimes, people can surprise us. Reluctantly, I agreed, though I harbored no illusions about their interest. The wedding invitations were sent, and as the date drew nearer, I tried to bring up the wedding casually with my mother, mentioning that there was an event I was organizing. But she barely listened, brushing off my words as she eagerly recounted Mike's latest achievements. It was as though anything I had to share was instantly overshadowed by the mere mention of my brother. Then came the moment that sealed my decision. I mentioned to my parents that the date of the event was fixed and unmovable. Without missing a beat, my mother informed me that they wouldn't be able to attend because Mike had a game scheduled for the same day. I felt the familiar pang of rejection, but this time, something in me shifted. I smiled politely and assured them it was fine, deciding that I wouldn't push or explain further. They'd made their priorities clear. The day of the wedding arrived, and despite their absence, it was a magical day filled with love and joy. My grandfather proudly gave me away, and as I looked around at the faces of friends and family who had come to support me, I realized I didn't need anyone's validation. The people who mattered were already there. And for the first time, I felt free from the weight of my parents' neglect. But life, as it often does, had a way of bringing everything to light. A few days after the wedding, I returned from my honeymoon to find a storm brewing. My aunt had shared photos from the wedding online, and the community had taken note of my parents' glaring absence. People began to question them, and for once, they couldn't hide behind their usual facade. The truth was laid bare, and they were forced to face the consequences of their years of neglect. When I finally spoke to my parents, it wasn't the heartfelt reconciliation they might have hoped for. I confronted them about years of being treated as less than, the hurt of always being second to my brother, and the impact it had on my life. My mother, ever dismissive, tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding, claiming that family should always forgive. But I stood firm, telling them that forgiveness was a choice, not an obligation. My father, for his part, was apologetic, but his words rang hollow. He couldn't explain why he hadn't stood up for me all those years. And the more he spoke, the more I realized that he was trapped in his own patterns of behavior. My mother, however, didn't bother to hide her disdain. She admitted, in a cold, matter-of-fact tone, that she simply didn't feel the same connection with me as she did with Mike. Her words stung, but they also brought a strange sense of closure. I had always suspected as much. And now, hearing it directly from her, I knew I could finally let go. In the months that followed, I focused on healing and building a life where my worth wasn't tied to anyone's approval. Therapy helped me understand that I wasn't to blame for my parents' choices. And with Lucas by my side, I learned to embrace my own sense of self-worth. My grandfather continued to be a source of strength, reminding me that family isn't defined by blood but by the love and respect shared between people. Looking back, I realized that my journey, though painful, led me to a place of peace. I no longer felt the need to chase the affection of people who couldn't appreciate me. Instead, I focused on nurturing the relationships that uplifted me, surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was. And as I moved forward, I carried with me the lesson that sometimes, letting go is the first step to finding true freedom. The unspoken rift, family ties, and silent resentments that broke my sister's marriage. As I waited for my sister's car to pull into the driveway, I felt a mix of excitement and nervous energy. I hadn't seen her or her wife, Emily, in months. With their baby on the way, I was buzzing with anticipation at the thought of being an aunt. Growing up as the youngest in the family, I had always looked up to my sister, admiring her as the confident, adventurous one who had paved her path. Despite whatever difficulties she faced, Emily, though I didn't know her well, seemed like the perfect match for her, a steady, practical balance to my sister's fiery spirit. I was ready to finally bridge the gap with Emily, my soon-to-be co-aunt, to whom I'd always felt like an outsider. However, I never anticipated the silent, cold hostility that would unfold during this trip. Nor did I realize how deeply it would impact not just my relationship with her, but her marriage to my sister. From the moment she arrived, Emily's response to me was stony, unyielding. My cheerful, hello, was met with a curt nod. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was her pregnancy making her tired or wary of too much socializing. But as the days went by, her indifference turned into subtle disdain. I'd reach out to make small talk about the baby, her plans for the future, or even the latest book she was reading, and each time, she'd answer with a brief, detached response or simply ignore me altogether. At first, I tried to laugh it off, telling myself maybe it was just her way, perhaps a reserved personality that didn't take to strangers easily. But I soon noticed that she was warm, friendly, even affectionate with everyone else in the family. It wasn't my imagination, she genuinely didn't seem to like me. My attempts to connect continued, though they grew increasingly uncomfortable. There was a morning where I found myself alone in the kitchen with her. I decided to make us both coffee, thinking maybe we could sit down and chat. As I handed her the mug, she took it, barely looking at me, and set it down without a word, trying to ease the silence. I mentioned how much I was looking forward to seeing her become a mother, how I thought she'd be amazing at it. She raised an eyebrow, sighed, and muttered something about how some people just don't know when to quit, and left the room. Her words stung more than I wanted to admit, and I began to feel the shame of a child seeking approval from someone who wouldn't give it. The idea of asking her outright if I'd done something wrong weighed on my mind. But each time, my sister would walk in, cheerfully chatting with Emily about baby names, nursery decorations, and family plans, entirely unaware of the frost that lay between her wife and me. It was one evening at dinner that the tension reached a point where even my parents noticed. I had asked Emily if she could pass the potatoes, and she didn't respond. I repeated myself, and my sister, noticing the awkward silence, nudged Emily with a gentle smile. Emily laughed it off, saying she'd simply not heard me. But I could see the look in her eyes, a kind of smug satisfaction as if I'd been put in my place. My parents glanced at each other but said nothing, likely assuming it was just the fatigue of pregnancy. As the days dragged on, I found myself alone in my thoughts, wondering what had led to this tension. A memory surfaced from the year before, when my sister and Emily had planned their wedding. It had been scheduled right in the middle of my college finals. When I'd asked my sister if they could adjust the date slightly, we'd argued, though she eventually shifted the date to accommodate me. It hadn't come without a cost. Our relationship had felt strained for a while. I remembered wondering if Emily had been involved in the decision and whether she had perhaps taken my request as a slight. I started to piece together that maybe, just maybe, she'd been holding onto that frustration all this time, never truly forgiving me for what she saw as an attempt to disrupt their big day. Despite my attempts to ignore the tension, Emily's passive hostility only intensified when I tried to compliment her for managing her pregnancy so gracefully. She rolled her eyes and muttered something about knowing how to read a room. I could feel my heart sink each time, a mix of anger and hurt bubbling under the surface. Eventually, my sister noticed my discomfort. One evening, while Emily was out shopping, my sister asked if something was wrong. I hesitated, unsure if I should bring up my concerns, fearing it would only create a wedge between her and Emily. But the words tumbled out, and I told her everything: the cold stares, the dismissive comments, the unspoken hostility. My sister was quiet, listening carefully, but I could see the tension in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that she'd noticed something too. The final blow came when my sister revealed that Emily had confided in her about her unresolved resentment over the wedding date issue, admitting she'd never fully forgiven me. Hearing this, I felt a mix of relief and sadness, relief that my suspicions had been right, but sadness that something so trivial had festered for so long. I offered to apologize to Emily directly, hoping to bridge the gap, but my sister warned me that Emily's grudges didn't fade easily. My parents, who had been blissfully unaware of the brewing storm, were shocked when they overheard Emily berating me in the kitchen one morning. She'd accused me of ruining her experience of joining the family, implying I'd somehow tainted her happiness. My father, usually reserved, finally stepped in, asking Emily to step back and show some respect. She stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. It was later that night when the true cost of this animosity became clear. My sister confided that Emily's coldness hadn't been reserved just for me. She had alienated many of my sister's friends, isolating her bit by bit. My sister admitted, with tears in her eyes, that this pattern of behavior had been slowly suffocating her, leaving her feeling trapped between loyalty to her wife and love for her family. She'd reached a breaking point, realizing that her marriage had been eroded not just by Emily's resentment toward me, but by a broader pattern of jealousy and possessiveness. In a trembling voice, she confessed that they were considering a separation, recognizing that the life they'd built together was becoming untenable. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I found myself overwhelmed with guilt and sadness. I realized how deeply unspoken resentments and misunderstandings could fester and poison relationships. Emily's actions, driven by a sense of unresolved bitterness, had cost her a family, and potentially her marriage. I resolved to never let grievances simmer, to speak openly and honestly about any issues before they had a chance to deepen. My sister, though heartbroken, assured me that she'd made peace with the idea of a future without Emily if it meant regaining her freedom and sense of self. As we said our goodbyes at the end of that difficult holiday, I hugged my sister tightly, promising to support her through whatever came next. The sadness was palpable, but so was a sense of relief, as though a dark cloud had lifted, leaving room for healing and reconciliation. From that moment, I vowed to be a source of love and light in my family's lives, to bring openness where silence once reigned, and to value the bonds that truly matter, knowing how fragile they can be. A betrayal close to home, my father's secret debt and the path to redemption. There's a certain kind of trust we place in family, a belief that, no matter what, they would never cross the line that separates loyalty from betrayal. But what if that very bond was shattered by someone you've trusted all your life? This story begins not with a dramatic confrontation or an explosive revelation, but with a quiet, hopeful step towards the future. A step that was halted by an invisible chain of debt and deceit. When I decided to buy my first home, I was filled with excitement and nervous anticipation. Little did I know, that simple dream would unravel a family secret that would shake the very foundation of trust. It was an ordinary day at the bank when everything changed. As I sat across from the lender, discussing loan options, I expected questions about my employment history or income, but instead, I was met with confusion. A subtle but undeniable shift in the lender's expression. After a few clicks and an awkward silence, he handed me a document with a frown. There, in black and white, were charges I had never made, credit card debts linked to my name, one of which was already in collections. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. How could this happen? I'd always been so careful with my finances. The truth, I would soon discover, was more personal and painful than anything I could have imagined. As I left the bank, clutching the documents with a mix of confusion and dread, a flood of questions swarmed my mind. How could these credit cards appear in my name without my knowledge? Who could have done this to me? I was a careful person, cautious with my personal information and always diligent about protecting my credit. This felt like a mistake that, perhaps, could be resolved with a few phone calls. I spent the next few hours calling the credit card companies listed on the documents, hoping for answers. Each call led me through a labyrinth of automated menus and repeated hold music, only to end with the same unsettling response. These debts were verified. I had no grounds to dispute them because, according to their records, I was the one who had opened these accounts. It was only when I saw the dates that coincided with times I was away or preoccupied, that a chilling thought crept into my mind. Could someone close to me be responsible? That evening, as I tried to sleep, the suspicions and anxiety gnawed at me. The following day, I decided to confront my parents, hoping they might provide some insight. I started with my mom, who listened to my story with widening eyes. Her face shifted from surprise to something darker, a look that hinted at long-buried resentments. Finally, she admitted, "Your father, he had a history of doing things like this." She paused, as though uncertain how much to reveal. "It was part of the reason we divorced. He opened secret credit cards in my name too, racking up debts I didn't know about until it was too late." The pieces started falling into place, and my heart sank. As painful as it was to believe, it seemed likely that my father had used my identity to open these accounts. Still, I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, clinging to the hope that there might be some misunderstanding. Later that day, I called him, careful to keep my tone light. When I brought up the issue, his response was oddly casual, brushing it off with a laugh and a vague warning that these things happen. He suggested I be more careful with my social security number. I was taken aback by his nonchalance. When I pressed further, he changed the subject, downplaying the situation with an offhand remark about how young people can handle debt better than us old folks. The audacity of his words stunned me. He didn't deny it, didn't express an ounce of remorse. He simply seemed to believe that my financial stability was a resource he could exploit, as casually as one might borrow a tool or a book. Days went by, and I wrestled with what to do next. I knew the debts weren't going to vanish on their own, and I could feel the dream of owning my first home slipping further out of reach. The only viable option was to file a police report. The thought of reporting my own father felt like a betrayal of my own, a step I struggled to take despite knowing it was necessary. A week later, in a casual conversation, I told him I might have to involve the police to clear my credit. He laughed, shrugging it off. "It's just a few credit cards," he said, as though it was no big deal. He went on, almost dismissively, "You can wait it out. They'll drop off your record in a few years." When I pointed out that waiting would mean putting my life on hold, he grew defensive, claiming he did it for the family and urging me not to overreact. But as the days passed, his lack of accountability weighed on me. I thought about the advice I'd received from friends, from people who had heard my story and told me to do what was best for my future. Filing the police report was the only way to regain control over my financial life, even if it meant risking the relationship with my father. The day I finally filed the report was surreal. I walked into the police station, feeling a strange mix of shame and determination. I handed over the documentation, explaining the situation to the officer on duty. He listened, nodding with understanding as I detailed my father's actions. After what felt like hours, he gave me a case number and assured me that my credit could be cleared once the investigation was underway. I felt a slight sense of relief, knowing that I'd taken a step towards reclaiming my life. But the relief was short-lived. My father's reaction was swift and harsh. When he found out, he called, his voice laced with anger. He berated me for overreacting and accused me of betraying him. The words stung, but I held my ground, explaining that he had left me no other choice. "You did this to yourself," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. He hung up without another word. The fallout within my family was intense. My siblings were divided. Some supported my decision, understanding that I had to protect myself, while others sided with my father, blaming me for escalating the situation. One of my brothers even stopped speaking to me altogether, saying I was tearing the family apart. Amidst the family drama, a surprising twist emerged. One of my other brothers checked his credit report for the first time in years and discovered 2 suspicious accounts in his name. His credit had also taken a hit, and though he lacked concrete proof, he suspected that our father might have done the same thing to him. The realization was heartbreaking, not just for me, but for my entire family. The image of our father, the man we looked up to, had been shattered beyond repair. As the weeks passed, the legal process continued, and I stayed in contact with the detective assigned to my case. He assured me that the investigation was moving forward, though the outcome was uncertain. One day, I received a call from the prosecutor's office, asking if I would testify if charges were filed. I hesitated but ultimately agreed, knowing that my story might prevent my father from causing further harm. Then, one day, it happened. My father was arrested during a routine traffic stop. News spread quickly within our family, and the reactions were mixed. Some felt sympathy for him, believing he didn't deserve to be jailed, while others, including myself, saw it as a necessary consequence of his actions. A few days later, he called me, filled with anger and bitterness. "You're dead to me," he spat, his words heavy with resentment. It hurt, but I reminded myself that I had done what was necessary to protect my future. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my life. Slowly, the fraudulent accounts were removed from my credit report, and my credit score began to recover. It was a long process, but each small victory felt like a step closer to reclaiming the life I had almost lost. Looking back, I realized this experience had taught me a painful but invaluable lesson about trust and accountability. Family is important, but sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones who betray us the deepest. I learned the importance of setting boundaries and standing up for myself, even when it feels like the hardest thing in the world. Through this ordeal, I also found a renewed sense of resilience. My father's betrayal had once seemed insurmountable, a shadow that threatened to engulf my dreams. But I emerged stronger, more determined than ever to build a life defined by integrity and responsibility. And while the scars of this experience may never fully fade, I know that I am better equipped to face whatever challenges lie ahead. In the end, as painful as this journey had been, I realized it had transformed me. This experience with my father forced me to confront the harsh reality that not everyone, even those we trust the most, operates with our best interests at heart. And while I wished things had turned out differently, I no longer felt bound by the hurt or resentment I had carried. The ordeal left me with a stronger understanding of what I truly valued: honesty, accountability, and the courage to take control of my own life. I learned that trust is a gift, not a guarantee, and that sometimes protecting yourself means setting boundaries even with those closest to you. Reflecting on it all, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. My father's actions had initially torn a hole in the fabric of my life, but they had also shown me a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I had rebuilt my credit, cleared the fraudulent debts, and, most importantly, reclaimed my future. The process wasn't easy, and the scars of this betrayal may linger, but I knew I had emerged stronger and wiser. The most significant lesson I learned was one I would carry forward: I had the power to shape my own destiny. I no longer felt defined by the pain of my father's actions. Instead, I was defined by my response to them, by my choice to rise above betrayal and to create a life founded on trust and integrity. I hope that others facing similar challenges might find the strength to choose themselves, to set their own paths, and to find peace in knowing they had done what was right. As I closed this chapter, I felt ready to step forward with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to build a future free from shadows and filled with hope. This was my story, my victory, and the beginning of a new, brighter journey.